Why didn't anyone teach me this? Like most friends in high school, I downloaded the Flow app to start tracking my cycles, mostly so I wouldn't be caught with an unpleasant surprise when my period began. But I'm not sure how much I really understood about how my body worked outside of that. Thankfully, I didn't have any crazy symptoms, but I had plenty of friends who did. We typically took a grin and bear it approach, eat lots of chocolate, laugh about the mood swings, hope that nothing too crazy happens, apologize for when we were way too emotional, and then just prepare for the next time. It was just sort of a fact of life, something you dealt with, and that was it. But for some of my friends for whom their symptoms were far worse and far more painful and debilitating, it took on a far more deeper significance, where they started to have an antipathy toward their very bodies, feeling like their bodies were working against them. And this even influenced the way they thought about children. So the thinking would go, well, if this is so painful just on my monthly period, then why would I ever want to have children? This really continued into college, and it wasn't until I was preparing to get married that I realized how little I knew about how my body worked. Something I would later come to learn was called body literacy. I personally think everyone should have this information, but in particular, ladies, this episode is for you. It's the conversation about the 4 phases of the cycle we should have had a long time ago. But at least we're finally getting to it today, right? I'm Emma Waters, and it's time to start rethinking fertility. Let's start with the single most important point. Women, you are not little men with a uterus. Yes, you heard me right. And you may think, well, duh, Emma, that's obvious. But sadly, that's not the way that we've approached women's health for decades. So, for example, the entire medical and wellness infrastructure of this country was built around male physiology. Men run on a roughly 24-hour hormonal cycle. Their testosterone tends to peak in the morning, run throughout the day, and then reset overnight. And that's the rhythm that most research is built on. Now, it's not because they actually hate women, and the reason that they've done the research primarily on men is actually because they wanted to protect women, particularly women of reproductive age. So I'm not saying it's this grand attack against women. It's just that the unintended consequence is that we've built all of our nutrition and exercise and wellness advice on men rather than taking into account this very distinct and different approach of how a woman's hormonal cycle works. So in particular, women have a cycle that runs roughly from 21 days to 35 days if it's a healthy cycle. And that cycle governs virtually everything: your mood, your energy, cognition, libido, immune function, stress response, and even who you're attracted to. Yes, you heard that one right. Dr. Sarah Hill, a psychologist at Texas Christian University and the author of a groundbreaking book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, made a fascinating point where she says that the hormonal fluctuations women experience across their cycle are not incidental to who they are, but they're actually deeply tied to how women think, feel, learn, connect, and choose partners. When you suppress or ignore it, you are actually diminishing and rejecting an entire dynamic system that, in part, makes you who you are. And I am not saying in the slightest that as women, we should be governed by our hormones or our emotions and simply slaves to the experience of our body. Far from it. But what I am saying is that we are embodied women, and part of learning to love the bodies that God gave us is learning how the phases of our cycle work so that we can govern it accordingly. There are 4 vital signs that your doctor checks at every appointment. These include blood pressure, pulse, respiratory rate, and your body temperature. But as of 2015, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or ACOG, formally declared that the menstrual cycle should be considered the 5th vital sign because it is so central to understanding the health and well-being of women. Think about this. The 4 vital signs that doctors tend to cover are essential to knowing if you're alive and how you're functioning. And ACOG said, well, if you really want to know how a woman is doing in particular, you have to understand her menstrual cycle and how her hormones are doing, because that is so crucial to understanding her overall health. And so that's why in this episode, we're looking at the 4 phases of the cycle to really empower you with that knowledge. And I want to make it clear, I am not a medical expert, but this is a massive passion of mine. And so what I'm going to do in this episode is do my best to translate the research from incredible resources like Natural Womanhood, Elevate, the Body Literacy Project, and of course the research of Dr. Sarah Hill herself. So let's dive into it. So as I mentioned earlier, a normal cycle for women runs anywhere between 21 days and 35 days. In fact, only about 5 to 10% of women have what we would call a textbook 28-day cycle. And that number 28 is so baked into period apps, medical forms, and our cultural understanding of the female cycle that the majority of women are benchmarking their bodies against a cycle length that doesn't actually apply to most of them. And we'll talk about in a different episode why this 28 number is so important for issues like tracking your fertility to avoid or try to get pregnant. But just know for right now that anytime someone says, oh, a typical cycle is 28 days, you should know, well, actually only 5 to 10% of women actually experience that. And it could be anywhere from 21 to 35 days and still be considered a healthy and normal cycle. Okay, so what is actually happening phase by phase? There are 4 phases of the female cycle. There's menstruation, the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. Your cycle begins on day 1, the first day of a full flow of your period. And this isn't spotting, but this is the day your period actually begins in full force. That really matters because in order to track your fertility and your cycle accurately, we need to actually track when that first day really begins. And during menstruation, here's what's happening. Estrogen and progesterone, 2 of the central hormones in a woman's body, are at their lowest points. The uterine lining sheds because no pregnancy occurred in the previous cycle. And at the same time, a hormone called FSH, or the follicle stimulating hormone, begins rising to recruit a new group of follicles for the coming cycle. And this phase will typically last anywhere from 2 to 7 days, or the time that you're actually bleeding in a given month. Now, I don't really need to tell you this because you already know from lived experience, but typically during this menstruation phase, you're experiencing things like fatigue, you're cramping a ton, you have lower energy. And I think what's really interesting here is that your body is actually purging toxins and resetting at the same time. So as painful or as uncomfortable as it may feel, there's a lot that's going on in your body that is actually very good for you at the same time. The menstruation period is also is often at least, one of the hardest times for a woman on her cycle. And this is the one where you can experience the greatest gaslighting or rejection from your medical professionals. As my friend Sarah said, her mom's generation had been taught to grin and bear it, like many of us are still told today. So when she started having these horrible symptoms and terrible pain during her period every month, her mom dismissed her, not because she didn't love her or she didn't believe her, but it was just so baked into her psychology that periods are painful and you just live with it. Well, in Sarah's case, it wasn't just that she was having painful periods, it was actually because her endometriosis that she didn't know she had at the time was starting to get worse and worse. And so she was feeling the symptoms literally during her period, which is why you shouldn't just ignore very painful symptoms, but actually see that as a sign that maybe something isn't as it should be. Maybe it is fine, maybe it's not, but you should actually investigate that and use your cycle as a guide to help you understand what's going on in your body. And it's important to note here that if your cycle is inconsistent, if it only lasts a single day, or if it's so heavy and painful that you're bleeding through tampons or pads every hour for multiple hours, that is not normal. Severe pain is not something you should just live with. It points to something that isn't functioning as it ought to, and rather just turning to a birth control pill that will often suppress the symptoms or suppress the worst aspects of your period, we should actually prioritize a real attempt to understand what's going on in our bodies. So that's the first phase, menstruation, the one we're probably the most familiar with. The second phase is the follicular phase. The follicular phase begins on day 1 of your cycle, and yes, this overlaps with menstruation, and it runs all the way until ovulation. This is the most variable phase of the cycle, and it significantly differs between women depending on who you are. So as FSH rises, it stimulates multiple follicles in the ovaries to begin developing, and one becomes dominant. So as that one dominant follicle begins to grow, it produces estrogen, and it does 2 things. First, it thickens the uterine lining to prepare it to potentially catch a human embryo if conception occurs. And it triggers the production of fertile quality cervical mucus. So cervical mucus that helps the sperm get up there if you're trying to conceive a baby. And we'll talk about cervical mucus in a little more detail shortly, but know this, it's the body's real-time fertility signal, and it changes in predictable, readable ways as ovulation occurs. So it's actually a way that we can gauge and track where we are around ovulation in our cycle. And to be very clear, if it wasn't, that dominant follicle is what ends up producing the egg that you release every month. So that egg that comes dropping down comes from that one follicle. During this phase of your cycle, you might feel things like your energy rising, your mood improving, and even increased sociability. Research shows that for women, verbal fluency and social cognition peak in the late follicular phase. Libido also begins to climb, and this is when women typically feel their sharpest, most outward-facing selves, and there's a really big hormonal reason for that. I used to joke with my husband that I only scheduled my most important meetings during this phase of my cycle because it was when I was the most charming and funny, because it's when women feel their most fun selves. And I think you can probably think of times throughout the month where that's certainly the case for you. This is also the part of your phase that is most vulnerable to disruption. So for example, things like stress, illness, travel, significant sleep changes, or dramatic fluctuations in exercise or body weight can delay ovulation by extending the follicular phase. And if you typically ovulate on a certain day and you've had a stressful month, your prediction or when you expect ovulation to occur can be wildly off. It's important to keep that in mind. So this brings us to the third phase of our cycle, which is ovulation. Ovulation is the event the entire first half of your cycle is building up to. It's the main attraction, if you will. And also, it's one of the most brief phases of your cycle. It comes and it goes like that. So once a surge of luteinizing hormone, or LH, from the pituitary gland triggers the dominant follicle to rupture, the mature egg is released into the fallopian tube. Even though the egg only survives for 12 to 24 hours, the fertility window can last anywhere from 6 to 7 days, 5 days leading up to ovulation, and then the day of ovulation itself. What's so interesting is that sperm can live up to 5 days within the woman's body. So the best conception days, if you're trying to have a baby, are the 2 to 3 days immediately before ovulation, so that sperm can already be in position, ready and waiting for the egg to come down. If you wait, for example, until you're ovulating, then you have a very, very, very short window for the sperm to catch the egg before it's too late, and you have to wait again until next month. And this is how you know that ovulation is approaching. The key is your cervical mucus. Your cervical mucus will start to transition from a thick, white, milky substance into a clear, stretchy, egg white consistency. A positive ovulation predictor kit or an LH strip, for example, will also help you know when that hormone is increasing and ovulation is occurring. And many women will also experience things like an increased libido or interest in having sex around this time. Now, one of the signs that ovulation has already passed is that the cervical mucus will start to dry up very quickly, but your body temperature, this other indicator of fertility and ovulation, will actually rise and stay elevated. So while cervical mucus can tell you leading up to when ovulation is occurring, an increased body temperature actually happens at ovulation in the days after and tells you that ovulation has or has not occurred. So one prepares you leading up to the event and the other tells you after the event whether or not it has happened. Okay, so this brings us to phase 4, the luteal phase. After ovulation, the empty follicle transforms into something called the corpus luteum. Sounds a bit like a spell you would say in Harry Potter, but it's not. It's actually something really interesting about how your body works. And at that point, your body begins producing progesterone. Progesterone does several things. It prepares the uterine lining for implantation by thickening it out. It causes the basal body temperature to remain elevated, so your body temperature is just higher than it normally would be throughout the month. And it thickens the cervical mucus into this barrier at the cervix, which is like a natural protective mechanism inside your body. Interestingly, out of all the phases we've talked about, the luteal phase is the most stable phase of the cycle. And in most women, it lasts 12 to 16 days, and it's relatively consistent from cycle to cycle. So this is the phase of your cycle where you feel the most normal. No crazy fluctuations are taking place, and you just feel good. Hopefully by the end of this conversation, you realize that the 4 phases of your cycle are actually this incredible dynamic journey where there is so much happening in your body, from hormones rising and falling, new eggs being developed and released, and the potential for pregnancy coming and going every month. And so one of the things I want to leave you with is that while this was an overview of your cycle, there is still so much to learn and know about the way your body works. So I would highly recommend finding a certified instructor who can walk through the 4 phases of the cycle in even more detail, and in particular, help you discern if the symptoms you're experiencing are normal or if you do need supplementation or additional help to correct something that's going wrong. So if you didn't learn this in sex ed growing up, well, now you know. My name is Emma Waters. Join me next time as we continue rethinking fertility.
All sources are cited in the show notes found in the description of this episode.